it's my pleasure to welcome to Dark Loop's Goodbye 2020, my dear friend and pop mythologist Daniel Jun Kim. Daniel, welcome to the program.
Hey, how you doing, Scott? Thanks so much for having me.
My absolute pleasure. For those of you who may have seen it, Daniel somewhat officiated over our Chadwick Boseman tribute back in the summer. We very much appreciated that. Very much appreciate his spirituality. And so I'm just going to have a conversation with Daniel here about 2020, particularly the same issues I've addressed with others. That is, what would you most like to leave behind about 2020? How did you cope? And what was good about 2020? So, Daniel, the first question then is, what are you most looking forward to leaving behind about 2020?
Well, I guess with anyone, it would be it depends on whether we're talking about societally or personally, because 2020 for me and I'm sure for many was a very unique kind of intersection of external societal craziness going on, coupled with some personal adversities. So that kind of unique intersection there really kind of made it particularly difficult. Um, so I guess just speaking briefly on the personal level at first, I would say, and this is, it's kind of a interesting question, but it's not really ultimately up to me in some ways. Like some of the things that I had to deal with in 2020 on a personal level, I can do everything I can. I can try my best to address these matters, but the ultimate result is kind of out of my hands.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of what I'm talking about has to do with like personal, family, medical crises,
Mm.
and things of that nature. So, um, there's only so much you can do. You can try your best, and then the remainder you just sort of leave it to, whatever the heavens, destiny, whatever you believe in, chance.
I was going to
um,
say choice and chance.
yeah. So, I mean, I would like to leave that behind, obviously,
Mm.
but we'll see. And the changing of the years is nicely symbolic, but it's not like magically things are going to suddenly change, right? Like I'm sure everyone is glad to be rid of 2020, and that is powerfully symbolic. But um, at some point there's going to be this sort of rude awakening for everyone, where it's like, gosh, it still feels like 2020, you
Mm.
know. Um, so it's nice to have 2021 here, but again, the basic circumstances really for now are kind of largely the same for a lot of people. So um,
Mm.
anyway, I'm getting off track.
No,
It's
I
just
appreciate your comment about the multiple intersections of just say intersections of trauma
yeah,
over the course of this year, different levels, societal, cultural, individual, etc.
yeah. So so there are those things personally that it'd be nice if I could leave behind. Although if I'm not able to, that's just life, right? So I would have to just kind of like deal with it. Societally, it's kind of the same thing in the sense that although I think more of that is kind of within my control to a degree, or not solely my control, but I can contribute towards the outcomes that I want to see. Um, and by that, of course, I mean all the many different things we saw throughout the year. Um, Everything from, of course, the pandemic, which is still going on, obviously. There's some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of like the vaccines, but most of us are not going to be able to get that for a while.
Yep.
Um, and it's not a universal panacea. It's not going to fix everything. So we're still going to have to do the things that we need to do. There's a bit of sort of like letting go in that department as well, where I can only do everything that I possibly can to be safe and keep others safe. I can't control other people, for example.
Mm.
So there's this kind of simultaneously, like you try your best, but then you let go at the end of the day. Um, and it's super frustrating when you're doing everything you can and you're making great sacrifices and you see other people not doing that, and it is frustrating. But
It's not only that they're not doing it; they're actually doing the exact opposite intentionally.
yeah,
I mean, it's
um,
it's.
yeah, and that kind of thing really does kind of sort of test the limits of human patience.
Mm.
So that's I think a lot of people, part of the struggle of 2020 was that component, simply trying to understand and grapple with this unbelievable kind of denial, or just
Right.
kind of active contribution to the problem on the part of certain segments of our society, and just kind of like resisting the temptation, just all out hate them, you know.
Yes.
um, because I
Yes.
don't, because I am of the mind that that doesn't ultimately solve things, right? Simply like it's understandable, but hate doesn't solve. So so you're trying to balance that, and it's really hard, and everybody just has to kind of go about it their own way, because there's no universal answer. And then of course, I mean, I can't even really get into the election stuff without just go on and on forever, so
Right.
but that by itself would have created quite the year for us, but that coupled with the civil unrest and the police brutality and the ongoing racism and then pandemic is just insane. I mean, this year was just unbelievable.
Yeah, and that sense of continual piling on, right? And it
Yeah,
just leaves one, dare I say, sort of spiritually breathless. I mean, there doesn't seem to be that moment when you catch your wind and you can actually, make progress.
yeah,
It seems like you're constantly reacting to something new.
yeah.
Um, just does it being 2021 do anything to that state? I mean, you mentioned something like this a bit earlier, but um, I personally do have a small sense. I don't know if it's just, while it's symbolic, the year's gone, but also the things that we do know are going to happen in terms of the
Yeah.
pending delivery of the vaccine, as well as the change in administration. I'm not sure. I feel like I'm totally caught my breath, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it, that's the catching of the breath is a big point, I think, for many people. Like there really wasn't a chance, and there came a point for me, because again we got to all sort of cope with it in our own ways, and maybe this would kind of lead into the question of how did I personally cope with it. But for me personally, and this would probably come as no surprise to you since you know me, but I mean, I had to tap into my spirituality in ways that like I never had before, which is um I mean, I'm trying to think of how to like explain it briefly, but it was a real test, and there came a point where I became particularly drawn to the idea of submission to the will of God in Islam, which I think is
mm,
highly misunderstood and kind of
yeah,
misconstrued in the media a lot. And you can easily sort of like misunderstand that as being kind of like sort of willfully accepting systems of oppression, for example. Like, oh
right,
yeah, just submit it to it, But it's not that. It's really is you do everything absolutely possible within your power. Um, but there comes a point when you know that you just can't control everything. You can only control what you can do. And you do that. And then at the end of the day, when you lie down to go to sleep, you just have to let go.
mm,
And even that I know sounds kind of like to some people, well, oh, it's easy for you to say, you must be feeling okay. I mean,
mm,
no, I'm not feeling okay, and I'm not have not been in an okay place. But what are you gonna do? You're just gonna like we can't be of help to anyone or anything if we're just messed up, right? If we're falling, and
right,
that's okay too. It's okay to be messed up right now. Everyone's in pieces, but um, at some point, uh, to be able to be effective in the things that we do, we kind of ideally, to some degree, would kind of be able to bring ourselves together in some way, have some kind of anchor, whatever that might be. And for me, it was spirituality, and this idea of submission in Islam became kind of quite beautifully appealing to me. Of in terms of I do everything I can, and at the end of the day, I just kind of there's a certain letting go, and it starts over. And the next day, you try your best again. And at the end of the day, you sort of let go, and there's kind of an ongoing letting go as you're doing it, right? So that because the alternative, at least for me, would be just burnout, and I'm not going to be of any
yes.
good when I'm burnt out to
Well, let's
anyone or
see.
anything. Yeah,
When we actually engage, we do it from the level of ourselves, and so there's a very strong sense of me or I working very hard. When I find myself unable to catch my breath, you referred to it as submitting to the will of God. What I find myself experiencing is thinking of things in larger and larger time scales. And I don't want to say the level of the cosmic order, but I do find myself trying to experience the moment and myself in an increasingly large space where, from a certain perspective, like as you're saying, I have only control of this very small part of the Venn diagram. And by putting myself in that space, um, detach my own current ego-driven engagement in the moment, and that provides, I guess, some separation, so some submission. So I think it may not be unlike what you're talking about, um, uh, because at some point, like you said, if you continually engage every moment at the level of ego, even when you're trying to go to sleep, uh, and you can't, well, and you can't solve it, psychology shows us it leads to learned helplessness, which
Exactly. Yeah.
leads to despair. And yeah.
Absolutely, and the kind of things you're talking about actually is quite similar because I want to be clear when I say God, the kind of God that I'm talking about is not
Right.
it's not a guy with a beard. It's a lot of things, but it's certainly not that.
Right.
And on some level, the kind of stuff that you were saying, that you could say that that is God on some
Right.
level. Uh, what I'm talking about is something that kind of really can't you really can't quite put words to it, right?
Yep.
It's not a guy with a plan, right? Because then he'd be like, "Whoa, that's some sick plan you got there, God," But it's
For
something.
sure.
So it's not quite that, but yeah. And I guess the other thing would be, since we are nerds here, um, there was a bit of that too. Not a whole lot, because I just the circumstances of my 2020 were such that I really just didn't have a lot of time and energy to put as much um, engage with nerdy stuff as much as I would normally like to. I can't tell you how behind I am on everything. I mean, everyone I know, every nerd friend I have is so much more caught up than I am. I've just kind of essentially given up.
Wow.
I mean, not like permanently, but
No,
like
I
for
get you.
now.
We'll catch
It,
you up. We'll get
yeah,
caught up.
yeah. Um, I haven't seen a single episode of The Mandalorian, as embarrassing as that is. I've not
Mm,
seen Wonder Woman. I know everyone's probably seen it the day it came out.
yeah.
You know, but having said that, I did do a little bit. I was able to this year, sort of as a gift to myself, I bought a Nintendo Switch, and that has been a godsend. It's been a lifesaver.
Mm,
There's not a whole lot of time that I have to play with it, but like an hour here, 30 minutes there, and it's like one of my friends and heroes, the author and game designer Jane McGonigal, talks about this idea of games as UBI, universal basic income, games as UBI for the soul.
yep.
And that's kind of like what it is. It's my little sort of daily bit of UBI
It's
for the soul.
it's amazing. I suspect we will be prescribing gameplay within 10 years.
Perhaps
Um,
even sooner, yeah.
yeah.
Um, and but yeah, that's been my little sort of miracle device. And other than that, sometimes when I had a chance, I would join in on like some tabletop role playing
Right.
online. One shot here, maybe a super short kind of like story campaign there throughout the year.
Right.
That also helped. Although at a certain point, I had to just kind of give that up as well. But in any event, so there was some of that. So it's a combination of the spiritual stuff and the nerdy stuff helped me
I
certainly
love it. Well, both of them
survive.
have to do with agency, right? And both of them having to do with controlling your sense of influence on yourself, your culture, your reality. I like this idea of game playing. I'm not a gamer myself. I was never any good at it. I mean, I grew up in the day of Nintendo, and I always got my butt whooped on Tank Command. I mean, it's just guys were better than I was. So my sense of agency was never that incredibly enhanced by gaming. But what I love about it is, you talked about at some point needing to disconnect, and what I love about gaming is it's this bizarre combination of disconnecting and engagement, right? Because you are fully agentic in this space that's been created to afford you that agency, but it's not the space that people often refer to reality, which is a distinction that is not going to last much longer either.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to hear that.
Yeah. Well, there's already the distinction is already being blurred in all kinds of interesting, fascinating ways. Not always to the awareness of the players, so to
Right.
speak, but like I think I see a lot of what's going on now as kind of being essentially LARPing, live action role playing,
Oh, there you
um,
go. Yeah.
with the kinds of stuff like some of the okay, so, I was sort of like hesitate to get too deeply into this right now, but stuff like like the QAnon conspiracy theories, for instance, or a lot of the talk of civil war, which I really think is like dangerous,
Yeah.
but I feel like people derive a certain kind of narrative, story-based satisfaction and sense of
Yes.
meaning out of it. That they're the imagined heroes, and there's nothing wrong with that. We're all imagined heroes of our own narrative, but the kind of heroes of this kind of constructed narrative in which they are the defenders of freedom and everyone else is like agents of tyranny, basically. So um, that's kind of like I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, and I don't have a clearly formulated theory, but it seems to me in many ways a game, but can you still call it a game if they don't think it's a game? You know, because
Oh.
the kind of game that I play on my Switch, I know it's a game, and I
Mm.
get certain benefits of it, and I know it's a game, and I can put it down, and that's that, and I go on with life. Whereas with something like QAnon, um, you never really put it down and turn it off, so to speak. It's always there, and you think it's reality. So to
Yep.
what degree then can an observer, third party observer, say it's a game, right?
No, I
And
love that conversation. Because imagination was the first UBI, right? I mean, the minute we were able to contain and maintain a simulation of a different place and space than where we were, uh, that's gaming. That's like you said, creating your own heroes and your own villains. And I think what you've said is something I've been thinking about how reality works for a long time. I mean, we in order to be someone in a social group, you have to have an identity. And that identity is a narrative and it plays out. You seek people who help you keep your narrative in one place. You avoid people who bring your narrative to a different place. And this is for me, this is a very beneficial way to look at relationships with people. And this does not make me cynical, but I look at what game are they playing, right? What identity are they trying to keep the same by talking to me this way, by talking to that person that way? And the fact that they don't see it as gaming, um, I think that's diagnostic. I think if what you would call enlightenment is actually sort of a breaking through of this distinction between game and reality, um, in the sense that, as Shakespeare said, we're all players, right? And I don't think that's cynical. I don't think it's trivial. I think it's just not accepting traditional dichotomies that at least Western culture sort of um, teaches us to embrace. So go gamers.
well, I just want to make quick clarification here, because you mentioned that one of the reasons why I guess you don't really maybe consider yourself a gamer or that you're not is because you're not very good at them. I want to make clear that I suck. Okay,
All
I'm
right.
constantly amazed by I suck at games. I do. As much as I love them, as important as they are in my life, I'm talking video games, not tabletop role playing, which is a different thing.
Yeah.
But with video games, I'm consistently amazed by how certain people, especially the younger generations, are how good they are at it.
Oh my God.
I can't wrap my head around it how good they are.
Yes.
So compared to that, I can't believe how much I suck. But that's not the point. It's not really what matters when I'm engaging with it. So
Mm.
and there's certain you just gotta find the right genre for yourself. So like that's why one of the reasons why I love like turn-based role-playing games, because with things, especially like real-time strategy, I mean, oh my God, I can't tell you how badly I suck at those. And things like, first-person shooters,
Uh,
the worst. I'm the
the
worst.
worst.
Um, but turn-based role-playing games, like Final Fantasy or like Dragon Age, things like these, right? Um, there's a different, there's a different skill set that you draw
Yeah.
from. So
No, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. I do think I remember seeing my my colleague's 10-year-old son playing Minecraft with one hand while eating a sandwich. And
yeah.
the degrees of freedom he was controlling in real time was something that I wasn't able to do at 10 years old unless I was an expert athlete or a pianist or something, right? But but computers have made it possible to actually control more complex realities with less complex body dynamics, right?
Yeah.
And so you don't have to train your body to be able to do all those crazy things you had to do to be able to be a good pianist. I mean, there is incredible amounts of skill in all of this, but I think it I think it's going to have profound impacts on neural development. I really do think it's going to afford earlier neural complexities that we as a species couldn't do because we didn't have the tools available to kids to make them do that. And all this is around this idea of coping, right? Because I do think a lot of the social media environments that kids live in now, I do think they actually provide a certain percentage of those kids, those adolescents, a way of coping with being an adolescent, a way of managing a narrative that's different than the one they hear at school every day, or those sorts of things. I mean, it comes with its risks too, right? Which we know of very well. But I love this idea of massaging agency, right? Of practicing agency in different realms, um, because that's exactly what we're looking for in coping. There's different ways to express agency. Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Um, Good things about 2020.
Yeah, and there certainly are, and like you mentioned earlier, it's kind of well, 2020 it has been a year in which it's been difficult for people to talk about both bad things and good things, and it kind of depends what they are, sort of like, so I sort of noticed that maybe some people who they may have had certain kinds of good things happen, because yeah, it's not all out absolute hell year. I mean, in some ways it was, but it was still, life was still happening, which meant good things can happen. Some people could have like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, babies being born and stuff like that. And it was the kind of year where it was sometimes hard maybe for people to talk about good things that may have happened, or bad things that happened, but maybe not, you know, bad as others or as bad in certain ways, Anyway, but to get to the answer of your question, yes, it was more like for me a kind of thing where it brought me back to a place of focus. And the last time I had that kind of focus was years ago when I was struggling with a very protracted medical illness that kind of essentially caused my life to fall apart. And all the things I had kind of worked for up to that point just had to kind of let go and start over. And it brought a certain kind of clarity and focus to my life that I had maybe never had before in my entire life up to that point. And then when I started coming out of that period gradually, the sheer excitement and thrill of being able to sort of essentially live a quote unquote normal life again, or a semblance of one, was such that I kind of just passionately engaged with numerous things, and it was exciting to sort of like live again. What 2020 did was kind of bring me back to a place where I just felt like the things that I was putting my attention on just became extremely streamlined and focused, and in what I think is a mostly good way, because it also kind of, certain things also brought me closer to just our general humanness and mortality, the limitation of time, the fleeting nature of everything, and um, that kind of tends to have an effect of creating clarity and focus. And it's kind of like, it's one of the results of, so there's, a body of research in psychology that's commonly called post-traumatic research, or it can also call like post-stress, a post-traumatic growth research, right? Or post-stress growth, because it doesn't necessarily always have to be a trauma, but basically any kind of crisis or adversity that's either acute enough or lengthy enough, or both, such that it kind of, there's this thing called the shattered vase theory. It sort of shatters your world, and you got to kind of like put the pieces back together in a way that makes sense to you. And that process tends to kind of like clarify one's values, and the things that kind of like, as I say, the things that really matter, right, at the end of the day. And so trauma has a tendency, not always, but it has a tendency to do that for a variety of reasons. And it's more likely to happen if you are aware of the possibility that growth within trauma is possible. So trauma in itself doesn't guarantee growth, but if you're aware that it's possible and you kind of do certain things to facilitate it, then it's more possible to attain growth. And it doesn't mean that you're suddenly all like better in every way. You could still be emotionally struggling in all kinds of ways, but growing in other dimensions of your life. So maybe, for example, a realization of how important family is, maybe, whereas you may not have known that before, or a certain kind of spiritual awakening for some people. And there's a lot of possible things, but I found that that was kind of happening again. It was kind of a second awakening of sorts, and in a way that I hope will last, in certain ways. And that's kind of largely up to me, because if I get distracted again, then I'll get distracted. But if I can manage to keep focusing on certain things, then those things will expand. What you focus on grows, right? So, oh, you're on mute, Scott. You're on mute.
It's all right. Uh,
um,
but
uh,
given what
yeah,
I know about you and how much you align your own agency with social justice and these sorts of things, I think you're going to find a very receptive, nurturing subculture that I think will move into an increasingly dominant culture and then over the next 4 or 5 years. And the reason I really like your story about finding growth in trauma at the individual level is because I think it's terribly important we look at the social level the same way. So it's felt as if things have fallen apart in the past 4 years, right? And it seems like we're just going down and down. At the same time, this is the trauma within which change is possible. And there are some systems theorists who would actually argue that this destabilization is actually a necessary condition that affords the emergence of some new type of order. So I'm extremely optimistic um, in the sense that the deconstructions we've seen over the past 4 years led to some of the most intense public demonstrations of hope I've seen in my life, right? And I don't think this energy is going away. I don't think it's going away, and it's going to be coupled with demographic pressure in this culture that's not going to go away. So this is what I mean when I say I think you're going to find a very receptive, maybe at first it'll seem like subculture, but I think over the next 4 or 5 years, as these forces make their way more robustly expressed in the culture, um, um, I think it'll start to feel less destabilized, and it's going to feel destabilized for years. Let's just make it clear.
yep,
As different people come up with different ideas for how to quote unquote move forward and they compete and struggle, we're going to feel like no one's in charge. We're going to feel like we've got, no common direction. That's how any destabilized system functions. And eventually, over time, systems work themselves through each other, and some type of more stable structure comes to be. I'm optimistic that's going to happen. I mean, because I'm optimistic that people are going to continue to work, that we have a promise to change, and that we're going to be in a political environment that's more open to that. Again, that environment's going to oscillate violently, man, and that's going to be a struggle. But I appreciate your comments about the individual level. I think you're the right person for this time, and I think you're going to find your efforts coupled pretty well with what this culture is going to go through in the next 5 years.
yeah, thanks. And yeah, it's just quickly to add, I've also been thinking about the collective kind of trauma and potential collective post-traumatic growth. And again, one has to be kind of careful when we talk about these things, because you don't want to like give people a certain kind of pressure where like, oh, come on, hurry up, you got to grow now. Because it's totally absolutely okay to just grieve and mourn, and even at whether at the personal level or collective level, um, it just you just there's a period where you just mourn and you
Yes.
just grieve and you're just devastated, and you don't have to think about or worry about growth, like whatever, just forget it. It just kind of tends to happen later, and at least knowing the possibility of it can offer a little bit of hope. But if you just don't want to deal with thinking about it, then you don't have to. It's like, our culture has a way of turning everything into like a achievement contest, right? Like, and that's totally not the kind of thing it should be. And I also agree that sometimes things just do have to be destabilized in order for anything to really kind of fundamentally change. Both personally, that's often true, I think, for people, and societally. And the important thing, though, is that the growth is not guaranteed, right? So
Nope.
I want to be a sort of like a cautious optimist, and I do believe uh, there's a lot possible before us, but it's not guaranteed if we don't commit and put in the necessary work. And a lot of us are going to have
Right.
to sort of make sacrifices for that. But if we want it bad enough, then then it's worth it ultimately.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's interesting. It's going to be like, for a lot of people, it's going to be this kind of intersection of personal and collective
Right.
disruption and or possible growth and change.
Yeah, and I don't think destabilization has to even be intentional at the cultural level.
Right.
It just comes around as a function of colliding forces. I
Yeah.
mean, when we look at the change in America, in the demographics in the country, when we look at the rise of social media, we look at the increasing lack of fairness in our economic system. And that's not a judgment call. Just look where all the wealth went the last 40 years, right? I
Yeah, no, I
mean,
think it can be a judgment call. I mean, God, yeah, you know.
well, when I see the
Yeah,
percentage of cultural wealth owned by the 0.1% in the last 40 years go through the roof, that's data. That's
yeah,
so that I think that puts a lot of pressure economically on a culture, and that pressure coupled with changing demographics, as well as social media, where there's voice space that wasn't there before. All these different things come together. No one's been, there's no need to have someone saying we need to destabilize. It just comes about at a systemic level because of these forces that are interacting with each other. Um,
yeah.
yeah. So, any final comments about 2020, Daniel?
Um, Honestly, so like I was thinking about this because a lot of people are sort of a lot of like creators and commentators and sort of public figures are sort of have been making their official kind of like end of 2020 type like statements and whatnot. And I was thinking about it, and I had some thoughts and stuff, but at the end of the day, I realized nothing really seemed sufficient. Nothing
Mm,
really seemed adequate. And that for me, again, to kind of, because I am this kind of like a spiritual person, the only thing that seemed adequate was silence. And and in our culture, when people say the word silence, depending on the context, there are often kind of like negative connotations or associations, and understandably so, because there are certainly negative kinds of silence, like when one is being oppressed and being forced to submit in silence, that's a bad silence, right? Or the kind of silence that Tilly Olson wrote about in her books, Silences, where you have creative, talented, wonderful people who are never really able to sort of meet the potential of their creativity because of raising children or whatnot. So you have all kinds of different silences that are not good. But what I'm talking about is a different kind of silence, in which, when you have like sometimes these great collective tragedies and people say, oh, let us have a moment of silence. And that's kind of almost like an acknowledgement that no words really suffice.
hmm
And that's
Yes.
because there's so many different ways to approach these profound kind of collective tragedies, right? So the only thing that contains all of that is silence. I'm talking about certain kind of like sacred divine silence.
Yes.
The kind of silence that if you were to like go into a Buddhist temple and just sit in there, and that kind of thick silence that's almost, it seems to be richly imbued with meaning. Um, like,
Can I use the phrase intentional silence?
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's not a forced silence, right, or an oppressive silence, but it's a
No.
kind of sacred silence that contains everything. It's the only thing that can contain everyone's experience, everyone's pain,
Yeah.
this year or any year, and just kind of keep it within its embrace, like all of it. If I were to say any one thing, that might appeal to some people, and it kind of like does justice to some people's experience, and it doesn't to others. But this kind of thick sacred silence that I'm talking about, that's kind of really kind of hard to vocalize. It contains everything. because it's God and God contains everything. So, or the universe or whatever you want to call it, you know. So so like it's weird because how do you put forth silence as the thing you want to say about your last words about 2020? You know, like I can't. And I'm speaking as I speak, right? So like words are already coming out, so silence has already been broken. But
Right.
I guess I would say, but that's really I feel like the only thing I can offer ultimately about this last year is that, you know, it's not even this year anymore. Last year, the only thing I can really ultimately say about it is just silence. You know, it's just seems to be the only thing that's adequate.
Well, what I love about what you just said, it's one, holistic, and two, experiential. Um, Experiencing everybody not talking intentionally is an extremely, probably the most intentional act. Um, so, Daniel, thank you so much. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, God. It was fun as always.
Bye bye.
Bye.